Hey everyone, welcome to the Leverage Your Podcast show. And I do love having the Brits on my show. So being born in Britain and all. But what I love about bringing my guest on, Will Barron of salesman.com, is that I find that podcasters can be very passive when it comes to trying to monetize their show, monetize their guest appearances. Either that or they overcomplicate it. And so I brought Will on because, of course, you have such a simplified process, and you have a podcast, Will. So I would love to start with obviously welcoming you, but I would love for you to share your podcast and your experience growing that.
So the podcast is the salesman.com podcast. It started interviewing sales experts, very quickly stopped interviewing sales experts because most of them know nothing about sales. And so I've done podcast interviews with Formula One racing drivers, an astronaut, Olympic athletes, special forces snipers, basically high performers in
Yeah.
any space, shape, or form. And the goal typically is to try and translate how, why, the strategy behind what they're doing back then into it's sales, but it's B2B sales, which is applicable for podcast owners, podcast hosts. It's also applicable for small business owners, that side of things as well. So
Yeah.
that's the gist of the podcast. In recent months, I've gone and done a lot more solo episodes because I've been a bit. You might relate to this. You might relate to this
Yeah.
at the end of this episode. I've got burnt out of interviewing people, so
Fair
I'm taking a
enough.
little bit of a break from doing that. And the solo episodes are doing pretty good. So yeah, that's where we stand with the podcast currently.
Yeah. And you were telling me off air how much business that you've gotten from the podcast and like over 700,000 downloads, which is bloody impressive. How did you growing the audience is one thing, but I find that monetizing it and getting clients from it is a whole different thing. So, what was your strategy going into that to convert those listeners?
So you said the word passive earlier, and I wrote it down. I feel like a lot of podcasters are passive with monetization, even with promotion. They just, I don't think in their hearts of hearts that they expect to upload 20 episodes, actually magically have downloads appear. But I feel like there's ego gets wrapped up in it.
Mm,
People feel grossed out by selling. They think it's not a ethically good thing to do. They feel like if I just put out enough content, especially small business owners, if I just do enough good stuff, magically people will learn about my products and services, and magically they'll end up in my calendar to have a conversation with them. That's not how the world works. It's not how the market
no.
works. There is You've got to help people help themselves in a lot of ways, and that's where the Seller Made Simple process comes. It has been built upon. So it's not a sales process, so to speak.
Mhm.
It is helping buyers along their own buying journey. And that is what podcasting is amazing for. So see, you kind of look up as I said that then. Sales process, salesperson, small business owner gets their pitch, shoves it down the buyer's throat. Some people says yes, some people say no. You know where you're at. The buyer's journey is buyer comes into awareness of a problem. So they perhaps tune into a podcast on how to
Mhm.
solve X problem.
Right.
They then go, okay, this is interesting. Maybe I can't solve this myself. I've got not got the time, I've not got the expertise. So they perhaps think, well, maybe this person on the show can help. If it's sales training, maybe I can help. If you don't help that buyer along the buyer journey by giving them the next step of the process, which for me is going over to salesman.com and downloading some free content and see if you're a good fit to work with us. If you don't explain to the prospect what that next step of the buyer's journey is, you're doing them a disservice, and they're going to go off on a tangent. They might listen to 50 podcast episodes from different people. They might end up all over the place, and you've not helped them solve the issue that they have. So inverting the sales process on its head and talking about the buyer's journey and helping prospects along their own buyer's journey, especially in a business to business podcast environment, slightly different in business to consumer, but in the B2B space, you you're doing your client, a potential
Mhm.
client, a disservice if you don't try to sell them on solving their issues.
Yeah. And I think we live in this brain process of like, we just assume that they automatically know who you are, what you're about, what your services are. and you assume that they're naturally going to take that action. But we just don't. Like, we literally need to be told, if you want this, go here. And they're okay. But you can't assume. And you're so right in that thought process. And I think that's part of the limiting beliefs on sales, is thinking that by talking about your offers, what you do, that you're like you're being weird and pushy. But if they don't know, then like you said, you're doing them a disservice by not telling them.
Yeah, well, they don't care about your offer. That's also something that small business owners get wrong, and
Mm,
podcast hosts, right? They don't care. It's not about you. It's about helping them
yeah.
solve a problem. So level one is you've got a feature. The feature could be, there's a button. Then there's a benefit. Pressing the button does this thing. What the buyer cares about, and we can talk about the nuances of creating content for buyers rather than creating content to get clout or to get views or to stroke your own
Mm,
ego. The whole content creation process is something that should be reverse engineered as opposed to just doing what you think the market wants. So we touch on that in a second if you like.
yes.
But the next step after feature benefit is desire. If you're not communicating how you can help someone fulfill a desire in a specific way by calling this number, opting into this piece of content so you get their email address, reaching out to you directly, adding you on social media, whatever it is, then you're not going to elicit any action from the prospect, from the listener whatsoever. And that's where people, they don't go deep enough into the desires of the buyer. You got
Yeah.
to understand where they are, what they want to get to, and then it's not about your product. No one cares about your product or service. It's about how you can help the prospect get from one side of that gap to the other, how you can help them go from where they are to where they want to get to. That's whether it's a product, it's a service, whatever, however else your value gets implemented. That's the thing that people want to hear about. And then they want to hear the next step is this or that
Yeah.
so that they can actually or potentially get started.
Do you find we skip that process of kind of like talking about the pain, what the problem is? We just leap jump into like, oh, here's what my offer is, here's what my course is, here's what it includes. And so
People who suck at selling do that. Yeah.
yeah, because you want I'm assuming you want the buyer to feel something about what you're talking about, whether it's that salt in the wound or the solution. You want them to feel something, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I call it the reality gap.
Mm,
So you got where the buyer is right now, and you got where they want to get to. The further apart these two realities are, the more urgency has been built. If there's no urgency, there is no reason for that prospect to solve their own problem. And if they're not going to solve their own problem, there is certainly obviously no reason for them to connect with you, to potentially work with you to solve it. So you separate them into two levels, right? The buyer's current situation. Why does it suck? What are the consequences of it sucking? What are the kind of long term, medium term? What happens if they don't get it resolved quickly? What happens to their team, their staff, their family, their mortgage if this does not get resolved? So that's pulling the current reality of the buyer one direction. The future reality, how can we make it within reason, bolder, brighter, more wonderful? What happens if you do get this resolved? What happens if this could be resolved in 30 days rather than 3 years if you try and do this yourself? What happens? These are all questions that you should be documenting. You should be writing them out and trying to answer them from your buyer's perspective. And
mm,
if you've got loads of sales calls in the diary, you just document what your buyers are actually telling you, because that's
right.
obviously the best way to go about all of this, as opposed to hypothesizing, having a hypothesis of it from your perspective, because your perspective is always going to be warped. Because you, as a provider of a service, have loads of intrinsic knowledge that the person that you're communicating with don't. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand the consequences. So if we're talking about selling sales training on this episode, or if that's not the context of the podcast, but if it was, I would be saying, well, if your current sales carry on as they are, what's going to happen? Are they going up? Are they going down? If you've got a recurring revenue product, are your customers churning faster than you can fill the top of the funnel? What's the consequences of that? What happens if a competitor comes along and wipes all that out? So we're really we're not building the pain in an artificial way. We're helping the buyer understand the situation that they're actually in.
Right.
we're helping them take their head out of the sand and really understand that maybe something should be, maybe there should be some urgency to resolve this problem. And if there is no urgency, fine. We're pitching the wrong product to the wrong person at the wrong
Mm,
time. So you can reverse engineer your podcasts from that framework.
yeah.
Right person, right message, right time. If those three align, a percentage of the people listening will want to reach out and work with you. I want to establish that again in the context of sales training. That's like, well, what happens if we put a process in place and we eliminate all the bottlenecks from the current sales process? How much more free time will you have? How much more revenue will you generate? How could that revenue be invested back into the business? Do you want to retire early? How could we shrink the time it's going to take to do that? And eventually, once we stretch these two things apart, the person that we're engaging with, you're going to barely share your website URL at the end of the episode, and people are going to be jumping on it and wanting to work with you. So that's what we want to be doing. And we want to be, especially if you're guesting on a podcast, you want
Yeah.
to come into the podcast with this in mind. Which I didn't do for this episode. I just wanted to come on and help. But if I was strategically wanting to sell to your audience, Lindsay,
Hmm.
I would be highlighting the pain that probably a lot of your audience has from a sales function, and then be talking about how things could be a lot better. At the end of the show, I'd be transitioning to, well, if you could try and solve this yourself. It might take you 3 years. If you want to get it solved in 30 days, you can work with me at XYZ website.
Now, I feel like it's easier, just like you said, when you're a guest, you're talking about the pain, you're talking about your expertise, you're talking about the solution. But when you're hosting your own show, how do you attract leads and convert them to clients in your own show? Obviously, you're doing solo episodes, so that kind of, you cover it in that aspect. But for normal podcasters who are doing interviews, like ads, or like how do you work that in?
So if you want to do it at a deep level, you have a clear idea of the problems that your buyers face,
Mhm.
and then you bring people onto the show to talk about those problems. So I'm happy to have like a competing sales trainer on my podcast. I don't care. There's loads of people who need help with sales training. There's an unlimited market. I
Yes,
think most people should go into the content creation with that mindset of riding tide raises all boats, that kind of thing.
agreed.
But I've also had experts on the show to talk about mindset, for example. So in my training program, we cover the 15 traits of high performers. And some of it, for example, one of them is assertiveness. If you're unassertive, you're not going to ask for the business. And so you could have unlimited leads coming in. You never ask, hey, would it make sense to move forward with this at the end of your call? And so you never win any business on the back of it, or you win far fewer deals. So I have had a bunch of people come in to talk about assertiveness. So on the podcast episode, this is what assertiveness is. You clinically defined. This is how it's resolved in a clinical environment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. This is the consequences of not resolving this. And at the end of the show, the expert gives their thoughts, and then you can give your thoughts of, oh, I think we've got this cracked for salespeople. If you want to improve your levels of assertiveness in the business environment, jump on a call with me, and then we'll explain how it works. So you can build all that pain, offer a
Mm.
solution via the guests that are coming on your show as well. And I would encourage people hosting podcasts, if they're doing a podcast to generate revenue, you should be designing each of your podcast episodes to elicit some kind of pain, to give a potential solution. And one solution could be work with the guest. The other solution could be, hey, come work with me instead. And obviously, if people listen to 5 or 6 of your shows, they're gonna want to work with you, and they're going to see you as the authority because you're the one that other guests are coming on, and your guests are gonna, um, make you look good as well. If they're a good guest and they know what they're doing, they're going to talk about you as an expert, and kind of pat each other on the back as you go through the episode itself. So it's
Yeah,
uh, it's it seems counterintuitive to have essentially a competitor on your show,
right.
but it typically, if you do it the right way, it's going to give you it's going to make you look good over the long term.
I love that. I have never thought about bringing guests on strategically for that pain point, if you will, that is somewhat parallel to what you're doing. Like
Mhm.
that to me is being very strategic, very
But
intentional.
you've done it. A lot of your
Yeah,
audience have struggle with sales.
yeah,
I'm here to talk about help them improve their sales. And
yeah,
some of the audience will go, "Oh, Will seems like a right idiot. Lindsay knows what she's talking about. Let's give Lindsay a call at the end of the episode. That'll be
Fair enough.
a large percentage of your audience who listen to
Yeah.
your show regularly. This British dude, he's all over the place. I can't understand what he's saying anyway. His Northern British accent.
As
I'll give
if.
Lindsay a call. But they'll be going, I learned a lot from the episode. I'll
Right.
give Lindsay a call. Maybe she can help me
Hmm.
implement this.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, to be honest. Now, in your podcast, did you use ads or like the intro outro to push is the wrong term, but talk about your own products or services? And I'm assuming you did a lot of tracking. How did you find out what works and doesn't work?
So I've worked with both external sponsors. We were
Mhm.
also the first podcast on the HubSpot podcast network. And so we worked with HubSpot for 18 months or so with their ads. And now I just do my own ads because I found my own ads are more profitable than working with anyone else. Obviously,
Mhm.
it's much shorter feedback loop to generating revenue and helping the audience. So for external ads, we've done pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll. Mid-roll were always the most effective. This is with companies HubSpot, Salesforce, Peloton, Microsoft, all kinds of B2B and business to consumer customers. The mid-roll ads were most effective. For me as a host now doing the show solo,
Mhm.
I find mid-roll ads really annoying. Like at the very minimum, I have to get my phone out of my pocket and I skip through them. I don't hear them anyway. So I only hear the first 3 seconds of the ad. As soon as the host voice change, as soon as the host's voice changes, because they're in a different environment because they pre-recorded the ad, when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm immediately getting my phone out to skip it. So
Mm.
now and obviously it's a case study of one, so that is
Yeah.
what it is. Um, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts over the years. But now, because they annoy me as a consumer, I only have end roll ads on my podcast, and
Interesting.
they are just as effective as what I've done anywhere else.
Yeah.
If you've got a pre-roll ad, sure, you're getting the attention, but you've not really delivered the value yet. And so I think that attention, if you're gonna make the ask, I feel like deliver all the value, have that dynamic change of pain, uh, brighter future. We might be able to help you. And then the ad comes right at the end. So there's no outro of, hey guys, I'll see you next week and blah, blah, blah. Because that's when people are skipping to the next episode of the show. It's got to be
Right.
short, sharp, and then the advert kicks in at that moment in time. So you're almost catching people off guard. And then they're listening to the advert, and if the advert's 20 seconds, they might as well just finish it at that point.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great tip. Now, what do you find most podcasters, what mistakes do they make that sabotages their ability to convert leads to sales?
Not starting with the end in mind. So there's two things. One is really obvious, which we'll come to in a second, but not starting with the end in mind, which is engineering your show around if it's a business podcast, if it's a podcast to your potential customers, the goal is to convert those customers. Maybe it's not a sale, maybe it's an opt-in
Mm.
of some sort. Maybe it's just to build awareness so that if you've got a seasonal product, when it comes to Christmas time and you do that big ad or that big ask, you've built all that tension in the marketplace, and so you get an influx of leads coming in. I do a lot of photography. I know a mate has a photography podcast, and he makes almost all of his revenue each year from a calendar of the previous year's photos.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it's coming up about this time now that all the photographers around the world are flogging all the calendars and doing pre-orders for them all. So he does his podcast, no mention of any calendars, no mention of any products. And then now every other day there's a quick interview and a massive advert at the end of it of,
Hmm.
hey, support the show, grab your calendar today. And obviously it keeps he does it from a perspective of being very real about it. Of if you enjoy this show,
Yeah.
some of you need to buy this calendar, otherwise the show won't exist next year.
Oh,
So he's very direct about how he communicates it. But he does it again, as I said, seasonally. So
yeah.
that's the first thing, being very clear as to what the point of the show is. Um, and some podcasts obviously start, you are messing around with your mates, you get a few people viewing it, you then try and reverse engineer a product out of the
Hmm.
audience that you've built, which is fine. But then it becomes a case of niching down the content so
Yeah.
that it leads to a specific audience that will buy or be interested in a specific product. So that's the first thing. Start with the end in mind. And if you're already going and you've got traffic, it started to reverse engineer all the content to get to that specific goal, which is a conversion. The other thing that people don't do is try and grow the podcast. which is crazy. People just expect that the podcast is going to just blow up on its own. And I found that out of all the things we've done at salesman.com, which is a YouTube channel, the podcast, we had a magazine, we did a load of
Mm,
blogging and SEO, guesting on other people's shows, both podcasts, YouTube channels, um, in-person events. Like we did a load of work with HubSpot. We did the podcast live with them at a big bunch of different sales conferences. We've Instagram, social media. We've done shorts, long form. We've done everything you could possibly imagine.
yeah.
And podcasts have been by far the hardest thing to grow. And so once you've
Yeah.
got a big audience, which I have now, it acts as a moat. It's somewhat secure because it's very difficult for other people to get stuck into it,
Yeah.
to take that audience away from you. But you want to optimize the conversion process at the same time that you're growing the audience size so that you've got something to convert. I think
Yeah.
that often, weirdly, but that often gets kind of dismissed. People want to just have better conversations, ask better questions. But if no one's listening,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the rest of it is a mute point.
100%. Yeah. And you have to be everywhere. It's funny how some people still will, oh, I'm on Apple and Spotify. Like, yeah, but you need to be on all the other directories. Otherwise, you're shutting out like a whole audience. But yeah, you have to be everywhere.
Yeah, I think it was beyond that. I think you need a specific strategy to grow the show. So for
Yeah.
me, that has been partnerships, for example, with HubSpot, and then the YouTube channel pushes tons of traffic to
Mhm.
the podcast. For my audience specifically, they don't want to come home from work and watch a sales training video. They just don't want to do it.
Yeah.
So they'll find the content on YouTube, and the podcast version. There is a podcast version of each video that YouTube video I do. The title the same for this specific reason, so that then people download the podcast, listen to it on the car on the way to work, where they're getting ready for
Yeah.
to go into the office or to run their business or work in that sales environment. So I get almost all these days, almost all of my new listeners come from YouTube
Oh,
to the
wow.
podcast.
Yeah. And doing the shorts helps too to attract new subscribers, new followers. Yeah. I want to touch upon one of the big themes that you have is simplifying your sales process. And it's so true. I mean, we complicate funnels. We like make them too crazy. And, we overthink, I think, sales process. How there are a lot of pieces to sales. How do you simplify it?
The first step is understanding the numbers. Nobody knows, very few, I shouldn't say nobody, very few people know I do a podcast episode, it gets 10,000 downloads.
Yeah.
That leads to 200 opt-ins to the content in the ad. That leads to opt-ins to a webinar, which leads to phone calls, which leads to products being solved. Once you understand each of those conversion points, the data behind it, what can affect it. So one podcast episode on a specific topic or a solo show versus a guest show. And this is a week's worth of work. This shouldn't take, you don't need a degree in data science to put this together for a small business owner, people like myself, for example. Once you know that data, then it's how do we just get rid of bits of that, the friction of the process. So for
Mm,
me, I had this big fancy webinar funnel, all kinds of automations. It was awesome. Then I just started doing a advert at the end of the show of, hey, if you think you might want to work with me, book a call at this link. It's like salesman.com/book or your call or something like that. And oh no, salesman.com/academy, I think it is. And they just book a call, and I just doubled my price because I'm now doing calls as part of the sales process. I
yeah.
doubled the price to make up for the fact that there's more friction for me from my side of things. But now the process for the buyer is incredibly simple. If they think it's a good fit for them, they book a call with me. We have a conversation. If it is a good fit, then we get them signed up, and that's it.
That definitely simplifies things. But I think it doesn't it depend on your audience and how warm they are and their buying patterns or habits. Because I've also had some people where they've guested on podcasts and they've, given book a call, and nothing happened. I mean, there could be a million variables, but it feels like it's sometimes a large leap to go from nothing to book a call.
Then if you're guesting on shows, you need to do a better job guesting on shows.
Mm.
If you are, and it depends what you're selling, right?
Yeah,
If your
yeah.
product is a book, then you're not going to have a phone call with every single person who wants to buy
No,
your book. So my product over at sellable.com at the moment, it's $5,800. So it's worth having a call with people.
100%.
That's like 4.5 grand in pounds in the UK. So my goal is one of those a day is basically the million quid a year that we do revenue wise. So it's not a crazy number of conversions or conversations that I have to get to that number. And at that number, I stop basically doing marketing every year. Once we get to that number, that's it. Happy, done.
Nice.
It's a ton of money, and it gets me to kind of my kind of financial goals. So with the way that works, so obviously it depends on the product that you're selling, the service,
Mhm.
and how the reason that you're guesting on shows.
Yeah.
But absolutely, if you're selling a medium to high ticket product and you are not getting conversions from your time on a podcast episode, you're either not asking for them, and you don't have to be a jerk about it. You can do it appropriately. Like what at the end of this episode, just an example, undoubtedly you'll ask me, how can we learn more about you? And I'll say go to salesman.com. All the content there is for free, absolutely everything. You can download the books for free. There's a free community. And if you need help implementing it, you'll find a way to contact me. So that's my pitch to people. And undoubtedly, people will go to get the book for free because the book has
Mm.
value. A handful of them maybe might be interested, and maybe two of those individuals will book a call. And about 50% of the people that book a call with me, I end up working with. Some of them are just not a good fit, and I tell them they're not a
Yeah.
good fit. Some people get on the call with me and they go, "Well, you're an absolute idiot." I take this is a waste of time, and so which is fine. And 50% of the people that I end up booking a call with, I end up working with.
Yeah.
And so you need to know what that pitch is. It should
Right.
be rehearsed. It shouldn't sound rehearsed when you communicate
Hmm.
it, but there should be, again, starting with the end in mind. There should be a point at the end of the conversation where you go, or the host asks you, which or undoubtedly they're going to ask you, and you share that pitch with them. And the impact of that pitch then will come from all the work that you've done across the rest of the episode.
Right.
So if you have delivered value, if you've been remarkable, if you've been someone that is worth remarking upon, then people will want to communicate with you. As long as the podcast has more than 50 downloads, someone's going to be interested.
Yeah.
If it's again this framework of the right person, right message, right person, right timing. Timing was somewhat we're not in control of the timing, unless you're very strategic about when you go on an episode or your product, for example, is seasonal. I bet there's a bunch of photographers out there in the previous example I gave that are now guesting on each other's shows to promote
Yeah. Yeah.
their calendars. But you're absolutely in control of the person because you choose the podcast you want to apply to go on. And you're absolutely in control of the message because it's, hopefully it's coming out of your mouth.
Yeah. And I have noticed, and I just want to point it out as well for anyone that's listening, that throughout our conversation, you have seeded salesman.com, you have seeded your academy, you have seeded, how you help people, and you haven't sounded salesy,
Well,
just
it's
natural
not,
in the yeah.
that's not me trying to like, it's not me
Oh,
trying to
100,
pitch anything. It was just used,
absolutely.
but probably it's me subconsciously using salesman.com as an example. So then
Yeah.
it is integrated in seamlessly. Maybe I also run a business called Photography Explained. Maybe I could have used that as an example. But that has nothing to sell to your audience. It has nothing to sell at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a fledgling kind of startup. So yeah, so maybe subconsciously I've done that. Used salesman.com as the
Hmm.
example, but hopefully it fits the
Yeah,
narrative of the conversation
100%.
we're having, and it doesn't sound like I'm. Again, we don't want to be getting our pitch and shoving it down people's throats because it's just not
Exactly.
effective, and people
Yeah.
will reject you on the back of that.
No, again, I was just saying you can naturally weave in kind of like what you do and how you help people in your programs throughout the conversation. So when they hear your quote unquote pitch at the end, it feels like a natural next step. It's not coming out of nowhere.
Yep.
Yeah.
The people should be thinking to them if you've done everything perfectly, and obviously some interviews go well if you're guesting on people's shows. Some interviews go terrible. I've been on both sides of the microphone from that perspective,
Same.
right? So that is what it is. But if the interview's gone well, the a percentage of the people listening should be thinking, oh, this person's interesting. I would like to work with them. So you're not even sharing a pitch at the end. You're just sharing the next step to potentially
Yeah.
work with you. So in sales, when it's a one-on-one conversation, I like to use the question, does it make sense to, next step? And that's kind of what you're trying to set up at the end of the show. So it's not, again, look at me, here's my features, here's the benefits of my product. It's, if you've enjoyed this, well, this was just a snippet of what we offer. It might be worth you reaching out to see if we can work together on something more specific.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I really want to emphasize is understanding those numbers, because if you don't see the correlation between one to the next step, then you don't know what to tweak and you don't know what to fix. And then you're stuck with what you have. So understanding those numbers are really super key.
If people looked at the numbers, about 80% of podcasts would cease to exist the next day, because a lot of people are putting a lot of time and effort into podcasting, and they may have an audience, they may not have an audience. They may be living a pipe dream that an audience is just going to appear. Building an audience on podcast, on audio only platforms is really difficult. It takes a lot of
Yeah.
time and effort. I've been running my podcast for like nearly 10, it'll be 10 years in December.
Oh, wow.
So when I started doing the podcast, people didn't know what a podcast was. I was like, well, it's radio, but not many people are going to hear it because it's not the BBC. And it's over video as well. I used to do it over Skype, kind of back in
Yes.
the
I
olden
remember those
days.
days.
And people would be like, what? And I was an unknown quantity as well. Now it's completely different. You can
Yeah.
get people on your show, people that you're probably really interested to speak to. But if you don't know the numbers and it's not driving revenue or it's not driving leads and there is zero growth in the past 3 years, you're probably better off spending your time doing something else.
Yeah.
There is a certain point where, or you might be better killing the show and then starting from scratch with something if you've not got any traction at that point. And I'm sorry, so there'll be some of the audience who are now like hands in heads, their hands are covering their heads in tears as they listen to this episode. But that's literally the case. You should be, if it's a business podcast or you're trying to drive business from your show, if it's not driving business, you need to sit down with yourself and really think, am I doing this because I like to call myself a podcaster and it's part of my
Yeah.
identity and there's ego wrapped up in that? Then you should question how healthy that is and how productive it is. And if you've got bills to pay, you've got a mortgage to pay, maybe there's other ways of spending your time. And it could just
Yeah.
be a new podcast, different twist. And again, starting with the end in mind with some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. What's one of the biggest mistakes you made with your podcast over the 10 years, would you say, or a big lesson learned?
Consistency, lack of consistency has been let me just show you this. 1 sec. So I have, it might not be able to see because of the background being blurred, but I have this sign. It just says, if I unblur the background, maybe it just says by my face. Nope, Zoom
No,
is too
it's not
good
what-
at blurring. It
I
just
saw
says
it.
consistency.
Yeah.
That's it. This sits on my desk. My goal of
Nice.
2024 is just consistency. And I've been terribly inconsistent still. I've been slightly more consistent, but not consistent enough. And with podcasting, especially because you can have push notifications on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the platforms, what people rarely do, because it becomes very annoying when you listen to 20 podcast episodes, you get a load of notifications each day. If you're not there with a new episode when someone pulls their phone out of their pocket because they're just about to drive to work, very quickly you drop off their radar.
Yeah.
It's not like YouTube where you Spotify is to a certain extent, but it's not really as effective as YouTube when YouTube they'll hold your video back for 2 weeks and then give it to the person when they log in. They don't care about how timely things are. Most podcasting apps, platforms are done sequentially via the publication date of the episode itself. So if you're not consistent with your output and it's not consistently good, the best way I've had it described to me is that it should be an episode of a TV show. And so each episode should hold the attention, should wrap up, and should align up the next episode of the show. And obviously, shows get cancelled because they just become boring. If your podcast is the same thing over and over and it hasn't reinvented itself, and every fourth or fifth episode isn't an experiment in something new, then people will just drop off and churn. And the most valuable podcasts out there are the likes of, Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, these massive podcasters, because every fourth or fifth episode is something completely different. It's someone left field that you've never heard of before who was really interesting, or it's a massive celebrity that you have heard of, but you've never heard them on podcasting as a platform. That's a trend that they all strategically move towards. That every few episodes, maybe every 4 episodes, every 5 episodes,
Yeah.
there's something different to re-suck everyone in. Then you listen to that one great show, then you
Yeah.
listen to
Yeah.
another couple of average ones, and then you get sucked in again because Madonna's on there or something like that. You think, bet she's got some tales to tell.
Yes, I bet. Yeah, that's a great strategy. Now, when it comes to your call to action then that you have on your show, is it better then to stay consistent with the same call to action, or is it good to mix that up?
No. Oh, well, it depends. For me personally, I help small business owners and salespeople find and close more deals in the next 30 days or your money back.
Mhm.
And I want to just get that and just drill it into people's heads. I want my
Yeah.
audience to be able to say that back to me. I want to be able to go into a sales conference, small business conference, and people come up to me. And I want them to be able to regurgitate that ad. I want it to be over and over and over and over and over again. So that's my value proposition for the business. So this is something I find a kind of slight tangent, but will be useful for anyone running a business or host or guesting on other people's shows, or even coming up with the podcast itself. You've got to have a succinct value proposition. I
Mhm.
help this person solve this problem in this way, and hopefully this way is somewhat interesting or unique. If you've got that and it converts, then that's the one thing you share over and over and
Yeah.
over again. Don't change things up. Don't become you want to be a master of one specific problem to be solved
Yeah.
as opposed to a generalist. If, in my opinion, if you want to make
Yeah.
decent money doing anything really.
That's a great tip to end off on. What
Cool.
is a last tip that you would give someone that is starting a podcast and they want to weave in the monetization strategy right from the beginning? What would you tell them?
If you're just starting off, none of this, what we just talked about, really matters. All that matters is doing 20 episodes and then buy a beer, bottle of champagne, whatever it is. Listen to 10 minutes of episode one, listen to 10 minutes of episode two, of episode 20, sorry. And there'll be such a vast difference between them in quality that then you can start to get strategic about it.
Mm,
No one's listening. For
yeah.
the first, how
No.
many, I don't know how many episodes I did before I got like 100
Yeah.
listeners. Probably
100%.
100 episodes. It will literally have been, and it's different now. There is more opportunity to get picked up. More people listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
So if you are very strategic and you're willing to put money on some ads, or you've got another audience that you can pass over to your podcast audience,
Hmm.
there is an opportunity to get started a lot quicker than when I got started with all of this.
Yeah.
But absolutely, the quality of the questioning, if it's a interview podcast, the quality of the production, regardless of what type of podcast it is, it's all going to exponentially go up. Then episode 20 is probably going to just trickle up over time. So if someone's just starting off, um, probably pause this episode right now and listen to another one of Lindsay's episodes where you talk about the those kind of things, because what I'm describing right now is where you can't sell to the market if the market aren't paying attention to you.
Very good. That's a great tip because honestly, a lot of people get hung up on those strategies. So they don't launch because they're like, oh, I don't have that all dialed in yet.
Yep.
So yeah, just start creating fabulous content and, grow your audience and then weave in your strategies. And as you said, start with the end in mind. So great tips.
Cool. And on the starting front, I've got a few friends who are looking at podcasting at the moment. Nobody cares. Just get going.
Yeah.
Literally, no one's going to listen. It doesn't matter. I will listen to a podcast with terrible audio. The host has no idea what they're doing. There is no fancy kind of intro music. If the content is interesting,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Fair enough.
there's a certain threshold that you need to meet. But talking into AirPods or a Mac or a $50 microphone is all you need. That
Yeah.
is it. The barrier to entry is not particularly high.
Yeah.
So don't worry about. I like all the audio gear and buying new toys and stuff. But none of it really matters in the
Yeah.
end. The
Agreed.
the quality of the content is
Yeah.
all that really is all that really moves the needle.
Yeah, absolutely. And personality and energy of, yeah, the people that are talking. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's why it's so fun. Now, you obviously have mentioned your book, and it is so well done. I love that it's a flip book and the graphics and the drawings that are in it. It just makes it so easy to understand. So I want to make sure that people have a chance to access that.
Cool. The book is called Selling Made Simple. You can grab it completely free over at salesman.com. There's another book up there called The Sales Code as well. Read Selling Made Simple. That's the sales process, how to find and close more deals in the next 30 days. The Sales Code book is how to become the person who is capable of implementing the sales process.
Ooh.
So, how to become more assertive, how to deal with anxiety of the sales process, how to increase your levels of personal accountability, things like that. But starting point, grab the free book. It's free, but it's an actual book. It's 450 odd pages long. It's massive.
Yeah, it's so
So
awesome.
it's not some crappy opt-in bait. It is literally everything I know about B2B sales.
No, it's very thorough, I have to say, and well laid out. And the size of it, even like it's just, yeah, well done. It's really good.
Cool, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on and helping our audience and podcasters get a little bit better at sales so that they can not pod fade and help it generate funds for their business.
I appreciate you having me on, Lindsay.
All right. We'll see you folks. And that's a wrap. We'll see you next week on the Leverage Your Podcast Show.